Okay, I had a pretty good question the other day from, well, a couple of guys actually, who wanted to know about how to choose chord voicings. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that today. This will be useful to you if you are starting out with jazz, blues, and especially kind of pop and rock piano. Okay, where choosing the chord voicings makes such a difference, especially if you're comping, especially if you're accompanying other people. Okay, so before we get started talking about chord voicings, let's just get some terminology sorted out. Okay, generally when I talk about chords in my other videos, I use two different terms: inversion and voicing. Okay, inversion is the term we use when we talk about how a single kind of joined up chord, if you like, a chord of consecutive notes, is moved into different inversions, different positions. Okay, so that is a chord of C major, a triad of C major, to use the technical term, in what we call root position. If we take the C off there and go for that C, it's the same chord, but it's in its first inversion, and that's the same chord in its second inversion, and then you come back up to the root position, but an octave higher. So root, first inversion, second inversion, root position. Okay. Obviously some notes have more than 3 chords, so they have more than 2 inversions. So C7 chord, root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion, and back to root position. Okay. So inversion is quite a limited term. Voicing is much broader. Okay. Voicing is about how you use the whole piano keyboard, if you like, to create the particular identity and character of a chord. So again, if we take the chord of C major, that is a particular voicing of C major. That's a voicing, as is that. That, you probably can't see it, that's a voicing. So it's much broader. We can still use the language of inversions, so we can still say that's a root position voicing because we're using the root in the bass. Okay, but I'm not going to dig into that too much today. Very broadly, I'm using the term voicing to cover the whole way you choose to play chords on the piano keyboard. Okay, so it is quite a broad term. So if we have a chord progression that we want to play, whether we're improvising a piano solo or whether we're accompanying somebody comping, how do we choose the particular chord voicings to play? Okay, well, really there are 3 factors at work. Firstly, there's the issue of spacing, how we space the notes out. Secondly, there's the matter of chord identity and how we make sure that it is clear that we're playing a particular chord. And thirdly, there's the question of giving the chord its character, which is usually to do with the note we play in the bass. Okay. First of all, let's deal with the idea of spacing. Yeah. Now, it's usually good practice if you're playing a chord voicing, any chord voicing, to make sure there's wider spacing between the bass notes than there is between the notes that are played in the right hand up here. So if you divide the piano keyboard in 2 at middle C, below this point you want your notes to be fairly well spaced out, okay, and above this point you can have them closer together. Okay, so that is a good voicing. Okay, nice and clear. That is not a good voicing. It might work well in some circumstances, but it's a bit messy, it's a bit chunky. The reason for this is that any note you play on the piano produces what we call its primary tone and a whole bunch of overtones. Okay, that's because when a piano string vibrates, or when it's synthesized in a digital piano like this, when a string vibrates, its main kind of axis of vibration produces your primary tone, but it also vibrates along a half of its length and a third of its length, and that produces its overtones, which go like that on and on up the piano, okay, in what we call the Overtone Series, the harmonic series. Now, if you play a note down here, you get a whole bunch of overtones coming up the piano. Okay, so that's why notes at the bottom of the piano sound really rich and thick. Your brain primarily picks up on the primary tone, but the overtones are there as well. So if you play a really big chunky chord down here, you get all the overtones. You get a huge number of notes actually being played at once. Okay, and it sounds really chunky and messy, and all the overtones fight with each other, and it gets confused. Okay, if you play that chord up here, okay, the overtones are stretching. First of all, they're weaker, okay, but they're also stretching way up there, out of the range of human hearing. Okay, so overtones here are weaker, and they're going up beyond what we can hear. Okay, down here they're really powerful. That's a kind of a bit of psychoacoustics background that you don't really need to know, but that's why we have to generally space our chords like that. If you look at classical music on the piano, usually classical composers are very careful to make sure we have good spacing down here, broad spacing and tighter spacing up here. Yeah. The tricky kind of questionable zone is between this middle C and the C, the octave below it, okay? And it kind of depends on the piano you're playing. On some pianos, on a well set up, well tuned piano, then you can play a chunky chord there and it doesn't matter. Some slightly older pianos, or if you're not quite in tune, then chunkiness won't sound great there, okay? Certainly when you're getting into that octave, then you need to be thinking about spreading out quite a lot. Okay, so there we go. So that's the first part of it, making sure that you're choosing chords that are well spread out, instinctively going for a big spread down here and a tighter spread up here. Okay. The second thing we mentioned is the issue of chord identity. Okay, and that means if you have a particular chord, you need to make it clear to the listener's ears that that is the chord you are playing. Okay. Now, obviously, most of your listeners aren't sitting there sort of saying to themselves, "Oh, is that C7 or C sharp diminished 7?" But it's a question of giving the chord structure of the song the necessary kind of strength, the necessary kind of underpinning. Okay. Typically, you run into problems with chord identity when you're playing 4-note chords, or there's a 4-note chord like C7, or even a 5-note chord like C9 or something in your progression. Okay. Because what you really need to do there is make sure that you're including all 4 notes of the chord somewhere. Okay? Because if you only play 3 notes of the chord, it won't have the same identity. Obviously, if you only play C, E, G, you're missing out the 7th, which is the really defining note of C7. But if you only play E, G, B flat, okay, outside of any other context, well, yeah, that could be a C7 chord, but it could also be C sharp diminished. Yeah, it won't be a major problem in most contexts, but if you get a chord, try to make sure that you're using its full identity. You won't always need to play all of the notes in the chord to give it its full identity. Okay, it kind of depends on contexts. Use your ears. Yeah, so if you have that followed by F, because C7 strongly results onto F because it's the fifth note, the fifth chord in the scale of in the key of F, then you probably won't have a problem. In other contexts, you might. There might be some ambiguity. Okay, so make sure you're giving the chord its full identity. Usually, what that will mean is that you've got important notes in the bass. Often, the root position in the bass, that is pretty unambiguously a C7 chord. Okay, that is a lot more ambiguous. Yeah. Thirdly, there's the kind of character of the chord, and this is something we've talked about before. What really affects the character of the chord is the choice of bass note you play. Okay, so if you play C major with a C in the bass, very firm, very solid. If you play it with an E in the bass, suddenly there's a sense of progression. Okay, that feels like it wants to resolve somewhere. It's not quite finished. Play it with a G in the bass, it's different still. Okay, so that bass note, because of its power and because of the number of overtones it's generating, really helps to define the character of the chord. Okay, so choose your bass note carefully. By and large, in a chord progression, most of the chords you see, you can play, to be on the safe side, play the root note of the chord in the left hand. So if you see A minor 7, play A in the left hand. If you see C sharp diminished, play a C sharp in the left hand. As you get more confident, you'll learn how to kind of vary the notes you're playing in the left hand, the roots you're playing in the left hand, to give the chords different character. Okay, so there we go. All kind of issues that in various places I've touched on before, but they were worth drawing together. So thanks for asking the question. In summary, remember, good spacing in the left hand. Okay. Make sure you're getting the right notes of the chord in to give it its identity, and think carefully about the note you're playing in the bass to give the chord its character. Okay. Apart from that, the voicing you play isn't really that important. It's a question of using your judgment and using your ears. Now, if you're playing a chord progression that goes something like C, F, G, then it might be a good idea to play voicings that run naturally into each other. So something like, okay, rather than, do you see how there's a more natural flow in? Okay, because the chords are closer to one another, there's a smoother run up. You don't have to do that, but particularly if you're comping, then working the chords into each other naturally, choosing the inversions and moving rather than jumping too much is often quite a good thing to do. So go away, find some chord progressions to play with, online from songbooks, whatever, and just practice playing those different voicings of the chords, and kind of learn by experience. Okay, see what use your ears, make a judgment. What seems to work in what particular context? Okay, remembering those three kind of guidelines about spacing your chord out, giving it its identity with all the notes, and also giving it its character with the bass note in the left hand. Okay, there we go. There's more on chords in my book, How to Really Play the Piano, the stuff your teacher never taught you. Lots of sort of chord charts in the back. There's a whole section in harmony, understanding harmony in the front. £14.95 for the print edition, and the digital download is £9.95 at the moment, and hopefully it will stay that way for quite some time to come. There we go. Any questions, give me a shout. I will do my best to answer them.